In our last two videos, we exposed the CIA's secret playbook for regime change. We saw how they overthrew a democracy in Iran to steal its oil, and then perfected that model to crush another democracy in Guatemala for a banana company. Their formula seemed perfect. A mix of psychological warfare, political manipulation, and a small proxy force could topple any government they didn't like. They were undefeated, but in 1961, their arrogance led them to a tiny island 90 miles off the coast of Florida, where their perfect playbook would spectacularly collapse. This is the story of the Bay of Pigs. It's the story of how the CIA, drunk on its own success, tried to use the exact same tactics from Guatemala to overthrow Fidel Castro's Cuba. But they made one fatal mistake. They completely misunderstood their enemy. Using Tim Weiner's legacy of ashes and the CIA's own declassified after-action reports, we're going to reveal how this one operation became the agency's most public and humiliating failure, a failure that pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war. By the end of this video, you'll understand how the CIA's overconfidence blinded them to reality, and how the Bay of Pigs wasn't just a failed invasion, it was the moment the world saw the limits of American covert power. If you're ready to uncover the real history behind the headlines, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Strategy Codex, and leave a comment below. Your support is crucial for us to continue this work. On January 1st, 1959, as the CIA was installing Richard Bissell, the architect of the U-2 spy plane, as its new chief of covert operations, Fidel Castro's rebels marched into Havana. The CIA's initial assessment of Castro was, to put it mildly, confused. Their station chief in Havana, who spent most of his time at the country club, reported that Castro's regime would likely collapse in months. Some CIA officers, like paramilitary chief Al Cox, even suggested giving Castro money and weapons, seeing him as a potential democratic leader. In April 1959, a CIA officer who met with Castro during his visit to the U.S. described him as a new spiritual leader of Latin American democratic forces. But President Eisenhower was furious. He felt the agency had completely misjudged the situation. As Castro began nationalizing American-owned properties and aligning with communists, the mood in Washington turned dark. On December 11, 1959, Richard Bissell sent a memo to CIA Director Allen Dulles. It suggested that thorough consideration be given to the elimination of Fidel Castro. Dulles, ever the master of plausible deniability, edited the memo. He crossed out the word elimination and replaced it with removal from Cuba. The order was given. Bissell immediately began assembling a team to overthrow Castro. And who did he choose? The exact same crew that had run the successful Guatemala operation. Jake Esterline, who ran the war room for Guatemala, was made the Cuba task force chief. David Atlee Phillips, the propaganda master behind the Voice of Liberation, was brought in to create a new clandestine radio station. E. Howard Hunt and Rip Robertson, veterans of the Guatemala coup, were put in charge of political fronts and paramilitary training. The CIA was literally getting the band back together to play their greatest hit. As Esterline himself later admitted, "I think their first reaction was, God, we've got a possible communist in here. We'd better get him out just the way we got Arbenz out." They were about to apply the Guatemala playbook, step by step, to Cuba. The operation, codenamed Operation Zapata, was a carbon copy of PB Success. First, they established a paramilitary force. The CIA began recruiting anti-Castro Cuban exiles in Miami, forming what would become Brigade 2506. And where did they train them? In the exact same remote jungle base in Guatemala that they had used to train Castillo Armas's forces, with the full cooperation of the new Guatemalan government they had installed. The plan started with 60 men, but Bissell, full of confidence, quickly expanded it to over 1,500. Second, they launched a psychological warfare campaign. David Atlee Phillips set up Radio Swan, broadcasting from a tiny island off the coast of Honduras. Just like in Guatemala, it pumped anti-Castro propaganda into Cuba, reporting on fictional uprisings and imaginary resistance fighters to create an atmosphere of chaos. Third, they created a political front. The CIA handpicked a government in exile, a group of Cuban politicians who would be ready to take power the moment Castro fell. And fourth, they planned for assassinations. Bissell, with Allen Dulles' approval, reached out to the mafia, hiring gangsters Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana to poison or shoot Fidel Castro. They tried everything from exploding cigars to poison milkshakes, but every attempt failed. On March 17, 1960, Dulles and Bissell presented their plan to President Eisenhower. They promised it would be a repeat of Guatemala, a swift, deniable, low-cost victory. They would infiltrate a small force, spark a popular uprising with their radio broadcasts, and Castro would fall within months. Eisenhower approved the plan, but gave a stark warning. Our hand should not show in anything that is done. The plan was a perfect replica of Guatemala, but Cuba was not Guatemala, and Fidel Castro was not Jacobo Arbenz. The CIA, blinded by its past success, made a series of catastrophic miscalculations. Their first and most fatal flaw was a complete failure of intelligence. Richard Bissell, the operations mastermind, was an engineer and an economist, not a spy. He had little interest in gathering actual intelligence from inside Cuba. He was focused on the mechanics of the invasion, not the political reality on the ground. The CIA had almost no assets inside Castro's government and no real understanding of his popular support. They assumed the Cuban people were oppressed and would rise up the moment the brigade landed. They were wrong. Castro was, at that time, a popular revolutionary hero who had overthrown a hated dictator. Second, they ignored the intelligence they did have. The few reports that trickled in from inside Cuba, and even from FBI agents listening to exiles in Miami, warned that the operation was an open secret. Everyone knew an invasion was coming. One FBI agent told his CIA counterpart that trying to overthrow Castro with the chatty exiles was impossible. The only way was to send in the Marines. The message was ignored. The CIA's own internal review, written after the failure, admitted that the agency's belief in a popular uprising was based more on wishful thinking than on hard evidence. Third, the agency was crippled by its own arrogance. The victory culture born in Iran and Guatemala had convinced Bissell and Dulles that they were invincible. They believed their own propaganda. They thought a few radio broadcasts and a small landing force could psychologically shatter Castro's government just as it had Arbenz's. They failed to understand that Castro was a battle-hardened guerrilla leader, not a wavering politician. He wouldn't be scared into resigning by a few radio reports and a handful of bombers. As the plan was handed over from the Eisenhower administration to the newly elected John F. Kennedy, these flaws became even more apparent. Kennedy was skeptical. He wanted to reduce the noise of the operation and make it less obviously American. He cut the number of initial bombing runs and moved the landing site from the relatively populated Trinidad to a remote, swampy area called the Bay of Pigs, or Bahia de Cochinos. The new location was a tactical nightmare. It was surrounded by swamps with only a few roads leading out, making it easy for Castro's forces to trap the invaders. It was also sparsely populated, making the idea of a spontaneous popular uprising a complete fantasy. On April 15, 1961, the operation began. 8 B-26 bombers, painted to look like Cuban Air Force planes, took off from Nicaragua to bomb Castro's airfields. But the airstrikes were a failure. They destroyed only a few of Castro's planes, and one of the bombers was shot down, with its CIA-supplied equipment immediately proving American involvement. The element of surprise was lost. At the UN, the American ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, flatly denied any U.S. involvement, showing pictures of the fake Cuban planes. He had been kept in the dark by the CIA and was publicly humiliated when the truth came out. President Kennedy, seeing the operation was already failing and that plausible deniability was gone, made a fateful decision. he canceled the second wave of airstrikes that were planned for the morning of the invasion. He was unwilling to commit the full force of the U.S. military to a secret operation that was no longer secret. On the night of April 17th, Brigade 2506 landed at the Bay of Pigs. It was a disaster from the start. Their boats were torn apart by sharp coral reefs that the CIA's intelligence had failed to identify. Their radios were soaked, cutting off communication. And instead of meeting a grateful population ready to join their cause, they were met by 20,000 of Castro's troops. Castro himself took personal command of the counterattack. His remaining planes, which the CIA bombers had failed to destroy, strafed the beaches and sank the brigade's supply ships. Trapped on the beach, with no air support and no hope of a popular uprising, the brigade fought bravely for 3 days. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. By April 19th, it was over. 114 members of the brigade were killed, and nearly 1,200 were captured. The Bay of Pigs was an unmitigated disaster and the CIA's first great public humiliation. The consequences were immediate and severe. First, it was a massive political victory for Fidel Castro. He had stood up to the American Goliath and won. His position in Cuba was stronger than ever, and he became a hero throughout Latin America. Days after the invasion, he openly declared Cuba's revolution to be socialist, formally aligning himself with the Soviet Union. The CIA's attempt to remove him had only pushed him further into the arms of their main enemy. Second, it was a profound embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. The new president looked weak and incompetent on the world stage. The failure would haunt him and lead him to be more aggressive in future crises, including in Vietnam. Third, it led to a complete shakeup of the CIA. President Kennedy famously said he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He fired the legendary Allen Dulles and his heir apparent, Richard Bissell. The golden age of CIA covert action was over. But the most dangerous consequence was yet to come. The failed invasion convinced Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev that Kennedy was weak and indecisive. It also convinced Castro that another American invasion was inevitable. This combination of perceived weakness and real fear led directly to the Soviet decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba 1 year later, bringing the world to the very edge of annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bay of Pigs proved that the CIA's playbook was not invincible. It showed that arrogance, wishful thinking, and a disregard for real intelligence were a recipe for disaster. The ghosts of Iran and Guatemala had created a monster of overconfidence within the agency, and that monster was finally slain on the beaches of Cuba. What do you think? Was the Bay of Pigs the CIA's greatest failure? And how did it set the stage for the decades of conflict that followed? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to see how this failure led directly to the most dangerous moment in human history, subscribe to Strategy Codex and hit the notification bell. In our next video, we'll analyze the secret intelligence operations behind the Cuban Missile Crisis, a story of espionage, deception, and how close we came to the end of the world. The books hold the secrets, and we're here to unlock them. Subscribe to keep learning.